It's a great honor for me to be here at the Empire Club of Canada today, which is arguably the most famous and historically relevant speakers podium to have ever existed in Canada. It has offered its podium to such international luminaries as Winston Churchill, Ronald Reagan, Audrey Hepburn, the Dalai Lama, Indira Gandhi, and closer to home, from Pierre Trudeau to Justin Trudeau. Literally generations of our great nation's leaders, alongside with those of the world's top international diplomats, heads of state, and business and thought leaders.
It is a real honor and a distinct privilege to be invited to speak to the Empire Club of Canada, which has been welcoming international diplomats, leaders in business and in science and in politics. When they stand at that podium, they speak not only to the entire country, but they can speak to the entire world.
Good afternoon, fellow directors, past presidents, members, and guests. Welcome to the 118th season of the Empire Club of Canada. My name is Kelly Jackson, and I am the president of the board of directors of the Empire Club of Canada and also an associate vice president at Humber College. I am your host for today's event. It's a virtual event, and it's all about tales from the campaign trail, majority or bust. I'd like to begin this afternoon with an acknowledgement that I am hosting this event within the traditional and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the homelands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. In acknowledging traditional territories, I do so from a place of understanding the privilege that my ancestors and I have had since they first arrived in this country in the 1830s. I want to recognize that last week across the country, many dedicated time to learning about the experiences of Indigenous children who were forced to attend residential schools. Many of those individual stories are untold, buried with them in the ground. And many survivors over the years who tried to tell their stories were not believed. I hope that we continue to find ways beyond the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation to honor these survivors and to hear their stories. And as we work to connect past actions to present realities, listening and learning from each other is so important. So we encourage everybody tuning in today to learn about the traditional territories on which you work and live. I now want to take a moment to recognize our sponsors who generously support the Empire Club and make these events possible and complimentary for our supporters to attend. Thank you to our lead event sponsors, Erin and Omers, and to our supporting sponsor, the Canadian Securities Exchange. And thank you also to our season sponsors, the Canadian Bankers Association, LiUNA, and Waste Connections of Canada. Now, I'd like to remind everybody participating today that this is an interactive event. And so those attending live are encouraged to engage with our speakers by taking advantage of the question box. You can scroll down and find that just below your on-screen video player. We'll try to incorporate as many questions as we can throughout the discussion. And if you require technical assistance, please start a conversation with our team using the chat button, which you will find on the right-hand side of our screen. We also invite you to share your thoughts on social media. I will be posting some different hashtags during the conversation, so you can use those on those platforms that are working today to engage in a conversation. And to those watching on demand or tuning in at a later date, welcome. I'd now like to officially call this virtual meeting to order. I am delighted to welcome and introduce the panel for today's event. David Coletto is CEO and founding partner at Abacus Data, and will be kicking off today's event with a brief polling presentation to set the scene for the panel discussion that will follow. Marika Walsh is a political reporter for the Globe and Mail and will be our moderator today. Jennifer Howard is Chief of Staff to Jagmeet Singh, leader of the New Democratic Party. Dan Mader is partner of Loyalist Public Affairs. And Braden Cayley is Senior Director of Communications for the Liberal Party of Canada. You can read the full bios of the panelists by scrolling down your screen. Our panelists today are going to share an inside scoop on what went on in the war rooms, on the buses, on the ground, all across this campaign that we just wrapped up as a country. They're going to let us know how the three of the major parties functioned, what they got up to, all of the good stories that we've been waiting to hear in the run-up to Canada's 44th federal election. To get it started, over to David to share those polling results and kick us off. David?
Hi, Kelly. Thanks so much for that introduction. A real pleasure to be here. We were just talking before the show started, more than 2 weeks, or just about 2 weeks since the election. It feels like a long time. This election was a short one, but also felt long. I'm sure more so for our insiders that will share their experiences on the campaign. Now, I've been asked to come and share some polling data based on our final survey of the campaign that we did over the final weekend, as well as a post-election survey that we wrapped up in the days following the election. And I've been asked to kind of give a sense of what I think happened. And it's not easy, and nor is it, I think, obvious that this election was about one thing. And my thesis today is that it was about multiple things, and trying to unpack the different forces and feelings and attitudes and impressions that voters had of their choices in the lead up to the campaign and then throughout this campaign is really my goal today. Now, we know the outcome. I'm not going to dwell on the outcome being very similar to the results in 2019, but obviously, that's a big part of how I think the public is reacting to the election call itself and whether they felt that it ultimately changed much in terms of the composition of parliament or perhaps the direction of the country. But it is worth noting that while on the surface it might look like this election was, a repeat of 2019 in terms of the outcome, I think there was a lot of important differences that were going through people's minds, and some of the divisions or cleavages that we had seen in this country over the last decade or so, I think continued to form. That will tell us a lot about how this new parliament's going to work, and what comes next in terms of our political system. Now, when you ask Canadians, how do you feel about the election results? You can see here that not a lot of folks out there are delighted or happy with the outcome. I think that's a reflection of their feeling about maybe the choices that were on offer or the fact that they were asked to participate in this election overall. But you can see that, if you add up delighted and happy and accepting, that's a clear majority of people who kind of give a okay, I'm fine with this. This is, not something that is overly upsetting. And that, I think, is a reflection of the fact that when we asked people what outcome they wanted, you actually typically got more people saying, I'd like some kind of minority at the end of this than either of the two main parties winning a majority, which I think is a reflection of generally the satisfaction that most people had with the output that the previous parliament had produced. Now, in terms of the takeaways, I think there's four in my mind that I want to focus your attention on. Unlike some of my colleagues in the polling industry, many of the online polls like ours didn't show a lot of movement from day to day. I for one, am always skeptical about the daily tracking polls that shows like 5 or 6 point swings over 2 days. That means millions of people are like waking up one day and saying, I'm a liberal today, and then tomorrow I'm a conservative. I don't think that typically happens. But what we see during a campaign, especially with telephone surveys, is I think difference in motivation and engagement that causes some folks to be more likely to answer a survey or not. So we saw very little movement after that first week of the campaign. I also think that this, as all elections, are about a choice between, the desire for change, wanting to see a change in government, and keeping the status quo. And that's a particularly important question in the midst of a pandemic. And that choice that voters were asked, to make between replacing a government that most felt had done a reasonably good job managing the pandemic with a choice or multiple choices that they weren't completely sure would do either a better job in the short term when it comes to the pandemic or a long-term outcome. I think what I'm going to show in our polling was that increased public anxiety or pandemic anxiety over the course of the campaign, I feel it was a double-edged sword for the Liberals, and I'll talk about that. And then lastly, with what I believe was a more disengaged electorate, did this campaign matter at all? And I don't want to take away the thunder from my campaign warriors on the panel today, but if no one's paying attention and there's a campaign, did that campaign even happen? That's a question I throw out there. So let's look quickly at the trend line in our vote intention numbers. And you can see once the election was called, the Liberal number dropped fairly quickly by 4 points. And then over the first 2 weeks of the campaign, the Conservatives caught up. And then from that point on, we saw almost no movement in our weekly tracking between the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the New Democrats, right? They all stayed more or less within 1 or 2 points of where they were. Now you saw that purple line start to rise, not as high or as fast as some of the online telephone surveys were showing in terms of the People's Party, but for the most part, this was a fairly flat kind of momentum. Even when we did daily tracking in the final week, we didn't see a whole lot of movement happening. Perhaps at the end, a little drop for the New Democrats, but for the most part, pretty stable numbers. Now that national number obviously overshadows some of the regional and demographic differences. And I'm just gonna highlight a few for you. One of the things I think happened in this campaign, and we saw it just in the seat outcomes with the Liberals, holding their vote or gaining vote in the case of the Lower Mainland, was really very much an urban and suburban base, and the Conservatives reinforced and strengthened their hold on rural Canada. This is the national divide by urban, suburban, and rural respondents. If you look at Ontario in particular, you see a really big divide. And so the Conservatives were able to close the popular vote gap in Ontario, but it didn't really matter in terms of seats because they didn't do it where the seats were. And that was in and around Toronto, Ottawa, and the larger cities. And so what we saw at the end of this campaign is actually, I think, a bigger divide, where in places like Saskatchewan, the interior of BC, Alberta, rural Manitoba, no offense, Braden, you'll come up later, the Liberal Party really doesn't exist all that much, but in large parts of urban Canada, the Conservatives are quite weak. Think of the fact they have no seats in Montreal, Toronto, or the formal city of Vancouver. And then for the New Democrats, one of the few parties that can actually bridge that urban-rural divide, where they have seats in urban and rural settings. I'm always interested in the demographic divide, particularly generational. Interestingly, in this election, our data suggests there wasn't really sharp differences in vote by age. You can see the Liberal vote was fairly consistent across the 3 age groups. The Democrats did slightly better among younger voters. They had a lot more potential among that group. This is those who actually turned out and voted or said they definitely were going to be voting in the election in the final weekend. And the Conservative vote, again, was fairly consistent. So not sharp demographic divides in terms of age. We did see a gender gap, but not as sharp as it had been in the past. But what we did see, and I think this is tied to the urban-rural divide, is among racialized Canadians in our sample, the Liberals won by almost 20 points. Among Caucasian or white Canadians, you could see the Conservatives won by 5. So that, I think, was really a feature of the urban-rural divide. So what was the campaign about then? And what can polling data tell us about the different forces at work? Well, the first question always, I think, is, especially with a government that's been in power for 6 years and is asking for another mandate, was this a change election? And we have the benefit of having previous data. So when you look at those bottom 2 bars on this slide, you can see when the campaign started, 43% of eligible voters said they definitely wanted a change in government. Over the course of the campaign, that increased to 50%. But when you look at that bar at the top, it was still either slightly below or about where we were in 2019. So in some ways, this campaign was about changing the government for those mostly who didn't vote for the Liberals last time. The problem for the opposition parties was that number didn't get to a point that really put the Liberals in jeopardy, where you had large numbers of people. Think of the provincial election in Ontario in 2018, where you had close to 70, 80% of people saying they definitely wanted a change in government, getting rid of Kathleen Wynne. We never really saw that. And I think part of that, in my mind, was because while I think, and we'll get to this in a moment, the opposition parties, particularly the Conservatives and New Democrats, did a really good job at litigating the so-called unwanted or unnecessary election. But what they didn't do was at the same time make a compelling case for change at a time when maybe the country wasn't ready for change because we're in the midst of a pandemic, the data suggests they didn't quite get there. And that, I think, helps explain why the Liberals were able to hold on to much of their vote from 2019 and hold on to those core seats that they had. Speaking about an unnecessary election, was this campaign about it? I think all pundits started the campaign saying, yeah, in 3 days, we're going to forget about the fact that the Prime Minister called this election when he didn't really have to. When we asked people what impact did calling this election have on their likelihood to vote Liberal, the first thing to note is more than half said it had at least some effect in their minds. 21% said, I will not vote Liberal because of this. Another 17% said they're much less likely to vote Liberal, 15 somewhat. That's an important data point, because many of the folks, particularly in those sort of middle categories, many of them actually voted Liberal in 2019. And so they started this campaign, I think, with a perspective to say they were annoyed, frankly. People were kind of annoyed that this election was called. Ultimately, I think it probably cost the Liberals, in my mind, their majority, but it wasn't enough to prevent them from winning the most seats in the places that they needed. And so in part, this election was about the fact we were having an election. I don't think you can move past that and say it wasn't the case. Was it only about it? I don't think so. And that's this dynamic between change and this election. Was it about issues? Well, the skeptics will say elections are never really about issues, but I do think there were a number at play. And because no one issue emerged as the top issue for a clear majority of voters, no party really benefited from it, right? So when we asked voters in our post-election survey, what was or what is the top issue facing the country? And we asked them to pick their top three. You can see almost half said the pandemic was the most important issue. But just think about it, we're in the midst of a fourth wave. We're still in a global pandemic, and more than half of the country did not choose the pandemic. So it wasn't the most important issue for everybody. It was important to many, but not everybody. The cost of living certainly was high up on the list. We had continued to seen it throughout the campaign beyond the pandemic as a top issue. Healthcare, the economy, the environment and climate change and government deficit gets you to about a quarter of people putting it in their top three. By the way, those were the same issues, if you take out the pandemic, that were in the top 4 or 5 in 2019. And many of them were in the top 4 or 5 in 2015 and 2011. And so we've had these same issues at the top, but the pandemic was certainly different. Now, when we look at how folks voted or said they were going to vote, in this case, it was how they voted because it's our post-election survey, depending on which issue they selected first. Here's among those who said the pandemic was a top 3 issue, almost 40% voted Liberal, 31 Conservative, and 19 New Democrat, right? So if this election was only about the pandemic, my mind says the Liberals would have won, and they would have won a majority government, and the other two parties would have been really actually close to the 2015 election results. If the election was about the cost of living, among those who picked this issue, you can see the Conservatives had more or less a slight advantage over the Liberals, but not a big one. And so the issue that I think all three parties really fought this campaign on in terms of their platforms, how do you make life more affordable for folks? All three came close to the vote share that they got nationally among this group. What about the economy? Well, here you've got the Conservatives well ahead, 47%, almost half of those who said the economy was a top issue ended up voting Conservative, 30 voted Liberal, and 8 for the New Democrats. You can see the challenge the New Democrats have on that issue, but the effectiveness that the Conservatives had in framing for a sizable group of the electorate this as a potential ballot question. What about healthcare? Despite the Liberals' attempts to try to use it as a wedge, I don't think it really emerged as one as clearly as they had hoped, because it was basically tied among those who said healthcare was a top issue. And finally, on climate change, second last, climate change, you can see here, if this election was about climate change, the Conservatives would have struggled and the Liberals would have done very well. Interesting tidbit. We ask a slightly different question in our surveys. We ask, which party do you think is best on these issues? The Liberals also won by almost 15 points on that question. 2 years ago, when we asked that question, the Green Party won outright. This time they were at 5%. It shows not only the decline the Green Party had in this campaign, but also the effectiveness, and Braden, I'll give you some credit here, that the Liberals have had over the last 2 years at making the public believe that they're the party that cares the most and are probably best able to deal with that issue. And so climate change was not the most important issue, but was important to many voters. Finally, if this election was about dealing with the debt or deficit, you can see the advantage the Conservatives had. This is a core Conservative issue. Almost half of them ended up voting Conservative, or more than half of them among those who cared about it. So if we look at the issue set by who owns those issues, the Liberals did have an advantage, although not a huge advantage on the pandemic. They also had a clear advantage on the environment and climate change. The Conservatives had a natural, as they typically do, advantage on the economy and the government debt and deficit. And then there was a pretty competitive race between cost of living and healthcare. And so if you think about, was this a change election? Was this about calling the election early? What issues mattered? You can start to see why we get to such a close race, why no one was able to break away, because no one really won the question of priming and issue salience over the campaign. Last point was this about the pandemic? Now, we've been tracking public anxiety or attitudes about the pandemic since March 2020. This is our trend line to March 2021. And so the red line are those who say they're getting more worried over time. The green line are those who say over the past few days they've gotten less worried. And you can see you've got the third wave sort of emerging out of the spring, and then it drops down over the course of most of the summer. A month before the election was called, we actually saw probably the most positive kind of public attitude towards the pandemic that we had seen since it first happened, right? Everyone was getting vaccinated. Everyone felt this was going to be a great summer. The worries about the fourth wave hadn't yet taken hold. We were seeing glimpses of it in the UK and elsewhere, but it really wasn't on our radar. And then a month later, you see almost doubling of those who say they're getting more worried. And then into the campaign, it basically holds, right? And so it didn't get significantly worse in those final days, given what was happening in Alberta and Saskatchewan. But there was a large number of voters out there who were feeling anxious about it. And I mentioned the Liberals had an advantage. When we ask a slightly different question, and we asked this throughout the campaign, and this was the final weekend, we said, if this pandemic gets worse, which party would you prefer to be in charge of managing things going forward? And you could see, despite the fact that in our final poll, the Conservatives were ahead by 1 over the Liberals in the ballot, the Liberals had a 6-point advantage on this question. Now, that would signal, obviously, advantage. The problem for the Liberals was, in terms of, and I hate talking about political advantage around a pandemic, but excuse the sort of insensitivity of what I'm about to say, but not enough people who cared about this pandemic ended up voting Liberal. Almost 1 out of 4 of that 35% ended up voting for a different party. And so so that signals to me that the pandemic was clearly in the public's focus, but it wasn't sharp enough at the end of the campaign to give the Liberals those few, I saw an analysis today, they needed 17,000 total votes in a handful of ridings to win a majority. But more than that, they needed a few points across the board, and they just didn't get there in order to win that majority going forward. Perhaps a few more weeks of this campaign, it may have happened, but the signal was that it wasn't. So to wrap up then, I think, first of all, if we look ahead, perhaps the precedent for calling or forcing an early election has now been set. I don't know if in 2 or 3 years from now, whoever pulls the plug or whatever vote might happen in Parliament, whether the public will react as negatively as they did during this campaign. But it is clear that we can't assume that voters are just simply going to forget that an election's called and we're going to move on to other things, especially if the opposition parties effectively keep it on the agenda, as both Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Singh did throughout this campaign. I believe that although the election results look similar, it has created some sharper divides. Yes, the Liberals have a few seats in Alberta, but the urban-rural divide, a government that is primarily urban, up against an opposition that is primarily small town, small city, and rural, may make for a fairly fractious parliament going forward. And so this election didn't necessarily solve for that problem. In fact, it may have made it worse. Now, obviously, the Liberals have an ambitious agenda. And perhaps the next few months, if this is Mr. Trudeau's final kick at the can, it may be all about legacy. And so agenda setting and prioritizing will be important. But obviously, the public is still, and we're just finishing a survey now that continues to show this, ending the pandemic and getting us on recovery remains their top priority. And so whether or not Parliament can kind of find common ground on that remains to be seen, but that's where the public's heads are at. So was this election, what happened clearly? I think you saw a confluence of multiple forces. You had tension inside some voters' minds between wanting to punish Mr. Trudeau for calling an election they didn't necessarily think he should have, but then not necessarily being sure that Mr. O'Toole or Mr. Singh were effective alternatives. And that often is the case. You can want change, but you still have to have an alternative. And that desire for change never hit a point that I think pushed the Liberals truly out of a place where they could get reelected. And so a fascinating campaign, despite the fact that those national numbers didn't really move. A lot was going on, I think, in people's heads, and it was one to certainly watch from the sidelines through the polls. And I look forward to the conversation now with Marika and this great panel. So Marika, I will hand things over to you.
Thanks so much, David. And I'm really excited to have this panel. They are people who are really core to every campaign, which means they have also not slept for 5 weeks, probably longer beforehand, and really gave up a lot to contribute to this election. And while they unmute their microphones, I'll just introduce them again for you. So we have Jennifer Howard, who was the campaign director for the NDP. We have Dan Mader, who was the deputy campaign manager responsible for policy. And then we have Braden Cayley with the Liberals, who was the director of advertising and the deputy chief digital strategist. So really stellar crew that we have joining us today to bring us behind the scenes of these campaigns. And Braden, I want to start with you and the Liberals, but I'll go around to everybody on this. And it's really just to, that question that nobody really loves, but we all like to hear the answer on is a self-assessment of what grade you would give your campaign and why.
Well, I would grade the campaign as maybe a B+ to A. There were obviously, not a majority as the result in the outcome, but an absolutely tuned, balanced effort from the ground up of people working for weeks and months to knock on doors, make phone calls, for smart digital campaigning to be brought to bear, a field program. And really, I think the best plan on several issues that in David's excellent presentation were key priorities for people on affordable housing, on pandemic response, on childcare, on climate change. The best plan, proven leadership, and a strong team, I think, were emphasized by us pretty strongly throughout. Of course, a majority government is, in the title of this panel, majority or bust, but I've been around long enough in the party to remember a 2011 election campaign and many before it that were a very different result. And now Justin Trudeau has won the most seats here in 3 consecutive elections, and that means he can get right back to work on the priorities that we talked about in the campaign. So mission accomplished in that sense of having a mandate to keep working on moving Canada forward.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to you now, Dan, with the Conservative campaign.
Look, obviously we didn't win, and so there is room to improve, and we're working on doing that. On the other hand, we went from 12 points back to 1 point ahead by the end. We took an unknown leader after a year of people not wanting to see politics and only paying attention to the government, introduced them to Canadians, began earning the trust of Canadians. Definitely learned a few things and room to improve, but won the argument in the economy, won the argument on cost of living, couldn't quite convince Canadians to change horses in the middle of the pandemic, particularly as it got worse towards the end. But began the process, I think, of earning that trust. So still pretty happy with what the team did, and very happy with what the leader accomplished.
Okay, and Jennifer, how about from your perspective in the NDP?
Yeah, we feel really good about the campaign that we ran. We had a plan for our campaign. We stuck to that plan. Jagmeet was very focused. We started with the many respects the most popular, well-liked and trusted leader, and we ended the campaign with people feeling even better about him. So those are all positives. We would have liked to have won more seats for sure. Our vote went up, and I think that's only true for us among the major political parties. And now we have to focus on turning those increased votes into more seats, and that'll be a focus for the coming time. But we had great candidates. We had a good plan. We stuck to that plan. It was a short campaign period, which is always a challenge, I think, especially for opposition parties. And it was, half of it was during the summer. But yeah, I think we accomplished what we wanted to in the campaign. The results were not quite what we wanted. And sometimes you do everything you know how to do and you don't quite get to where you want to go. So we have some work to do for next time.
Okay, so I think you've all given me the glass half full approach or perspective on your campaign. So I appreciate that. I want to dig in a bit more first on the end result, and then we'll kind of go back through some of the machinations of the campaign, because you guys have sort of touched on this now. Braden, what strikes me, and David Hurley actually posted this as well, he's a former Liberal campaign manager as well, is just how much the Liberals were able to make every vote count in truly a remarkable way. In 2006, the Liberals won 30.2% of the vote and 103 seats. In 2021, the Liberals won 32.6% of the vote, so just shy of 2 points more, and government and 159 seats. So can you explain how that happened? What has changed in the Liberal machine that makes your vote count so much more in each of these ridings?
Well, it's people, people, people. It's a party that has made some really important decisions with Justin Trudeau's leadership, frankly, to open up the party, make it completely free for people to join, and then to put up their hand to volunteer long before a campaign begins. And so, a huge volunteer army really that, had done, well over 24 national days of action before the writ ever dropped in this cycle, knocked on or made calls to 18 million different people in the lead up to Election Day. And then, yeah, you're right, like a very focused campaign effort that is, really devoted to, following the data, listening to the insights that you're hearing from campaigns and what volunteers are getting on the doorstep, and then focusing that carefully into the ridings that are close, and knowing when those ridings are close so that you can devote volunteerism or advertising into making a difference there right up to the wire on Election Day. And one of my best examples, I think, of that is actually from 2019, but I think illustrates it. Hochelaga was won by just a couple hundred votes in 2019 if the seat was flipped. And that was after the biggest single team of volunteerism on Election Day anywhere in the country. So people were able to focus volunteers there, focus the campaign, and turn a seat. And there was a lot of that in 2021 that made a key difference to this close outcome, but a very strong seat outcome for the Liberal Party.
And Dan, I think that's what, some of the reporting maybe during the campaign misses that when we're talking about the national popular vote numbers. It doesn't always translate, as we see for the second time, how that filters down to seats. And so I'm wondering, from the Conservative perspective, does the party see it as a problem of the get out the vote machine? Does it see it as a problem of where their votes are in the urban versus rural divide? Or how does it view this really conundrum for you guys of having the most votes, but not the most seats?
Yeah, look, that is definitely one of the challenges that our party has faced over the last 5-6 years, is that we win by huge margins in rural areas. We win by huge margins in places in the West, particularly Alberta and Saskatchewan, and then might lose a bunch of seats by smaller margins in places like the GTA or Lower Mainland of BC. And so one of the things we're working on this campaign was that, and it was basically, it's about earning trust of voters in areas like the GTA, Vancouver, Atlantic Canada, where we were totally shut out in 2019, had been working to kind of get back into competition there. And that's one thing we were pleased that we're able to do in this campaign. Looks like it's gonna take us a couple campaigns to fully earn that trust, but we made gains in those areas. We made big gains in several provinces in Atlantic Canada. We're not shut out of Newfoundland anymore. Made big gains in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in terms of increasing our vote share there. Gained votes in Ontario. And I think that our approach worked in terms of that. Not quite enough. Another point or so, particularly if the NDP did a point or two better also, and a whole lot of seats start flipping in our direction. So there's more work to be done. But we saw that definitely as an issue, the concentration of our votes in rural and western areas, and something we've been working to address and started to address in this election.
And Jennifer, do you see it as a get out the vote challenge for the New Democrats that, especially in downtown Toronto, for example, there were some very tight races that just didn't quite fall your way. So what was that sort of tipping point that gave it to the Liberals compared to the NDP?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a really good question, and we're going to spend some time, really delving into the data to make sure we have the right answers or we're fixing the right things. But I do think turnout was a challenge for us. We knew it was going to be from the beginning. We knew it was going to be in a pandemic election. Typically our voters sometimes have a harder time getting out to the polls for lots of reasons. And I think that may have been true this time. When you're spending the day and all you hear on the news is the lineup is 3 hours long and you need to take transit or have someone look after your kids or, whatever, that can turn away voters. I think there's a piece of work for all of us to do between now and the next election to work with Elections Canada on how we make increasing turnout part of their mandate and how we make voting more accessible. So I think that was going to be a challenge from the beginning. We did a lot of things to try to drive turnout, and I think some of them successfully, but I think we also knew that was going to be hard for a lot of our folks, not just in downtown Toronto, but we've heard some really disturbing stories from Indigenous communities, which didn't even have polls on election day. And that, I think, is something we're going to have to investigate and work on as we move forward.
Does the NDP have, as Braden kind of describes this army of volunteers, does it have that same resource base that the Liberals seem to be able to draw on in those key moments?
I feel pretty good about the folks that we engaged in this campaign, the people that we have on the ground, the people that we have in digital spaces doing that work. I think there's more work to do there, and I think there's also work to do in focusing those people. In coming into this campaign, one of the things I wanted to do is stop the trend, which 2011 has seen us lose seats every campaign, and we did that this time. I would like to have succeeded even greater, but we did that. And that is because we had a lot more people engaged, both on the ground, but also in digital spaces, talking to their friends and relatives about voting for Jagmeet. And I think there's just more to build on there.
Okay, I'm going to rewind now to mid-August when it was still sunny and we still had tans and, there was a spring in all our steps before winter. And I turn to Braden now because I think each campaign had something that the Ottawa bubble or the pundits in Ottawa were kind of scratching their heads over. And I'll start with the Liberals, but I'll go around and then hopefully we can all weigh in on this. And for Braden, I think that it was this question of the why the election was called, but also the appearance that despite calling the election and telegraphing the election was coming for so long, the Liberals didn't seem quite ready for the start line. And what I mean by that is that, for example, Radio Canada reported that the Prime Minister was still calling around looking for the big idea in the first week of the campaign. And we didn't see the sort of policy issue that matched the rhetoric from the Prime Minister when he went to the Governor General's house. So what happened there? Do you agree with some of the commentary that you weren't quite ready or it wasn't as finessed, or how do you see it?
Yeah, I think that there were, in the first 7 to 10 days of the campaign, actually a series of announcements by the Liberal campaign that while there was a lot of media discussion about the timing of the election, and of course there were the events taking place out of Afghanistan, but important ground that was being set there on issues like the pandemic response, a plan to finish the fight against COVID-19, an announcement, for instance, that mattered a lot to people in British Columbia, where I originally hail from, about responding to extreme weather events like the fires and heat events, extreme heat events that have been seen throughout the summer. These were, important issues that, as David laid out, whether it was on the pandemic or on climate, and they were put out by the Prime Minister in the first 7 to 10 days of the campaign. So I do think, he and the campaign writ large opened with important pieces there that were important to the closing days as well. Of course, it was, a different dynamic this time that the Conservatives and NDP did put their closer two platforms out pretty quickly, in the first handful of days of the campaign, or just before it, I believe, in the NDP's case. So that does establish, I think, a difference in terms of a lot of the coverage that takes place, when ours was still as it had been in 2019, right before the debates began. But important groundwork there that was laid in the plans question in that first week.
But that's also when you saw your lead disappear, right? That's when you saw the majority, at least in the national polls, disappear. So did something go wrong in those weeks, or did it go as planned?
I think, if you had asked many Liberals, I think many of the other parties' representatives on this panel today, if some of the numbers that were being seen in public opinion polling in July were an honest, accurate reflection of what you might expect, there were some, polls, I think, that had the Conservatives at 24 or 25%. I don't think anyone that had been involved in general election campaigns had quite believed that was real. And then, of course, when the Prime Minister has been out every day working on the pandemic, and you see his announcements and that dominates the news coverage, it's going to make a difference when suddenly there's 3 or 4 other leaders that are being covered on an equal basis, their own campaign buses and planes, their own announcements every single day. So to some extent, that's not unexpected, I don't think. And I do, as I mentioned, think that the PM laid some very important policy ground in that week that was very important to people's decisions in the final few days.
Dan, how did the Conservative campaign, what was the perspective from the Conservative campaign in that first week on the Liberal campaign?
We're honestly a little surprised that Liberals seemed to come out of the gate a little more slowly than we would have expected. We kept saying, this is an experienced campaign team. We know that they're going to kind of catch up, but we were a little surprised. But we mostly just focused on our plan. We had a plan, which was a plan to release the plan, which I'm sure you saw once or twice during the campaign, to get that out,
never
to talk about it. And, initially when we got into the election, the issues that mattered to people were who has a plan to kind of rebuild Canada, rebuild our economy, get people back to work, and who can tackle the cost of living. And what we tried to do is just every day relentlessly talk about those issues. And as long as those issues continued to be top of mind, which they did for the first 3 weeks, every day we were seeing results and moving the numbers in our direction.
Okay, I'm quickly running out of time. So Jennifer, I'll just get you really quickly on the Liberals, but then I do need to go to Dan and Jennifer on their own campaigns before we go to audience Q&As. So just briefly, Jennifer, on the Liberals.
Sure. I mean, I think what was a surprise to me was how much why did you call the election stuck around? I think the common wisdom was that would fade, and it really never did. And I think, even we underestimated how angry and annoyed people were about that and how opportunistic it looked, which just kind of, I think, reinforced some of the doubts people already had about the Prime Minister.
Okay. And before we go to my question for the Conservatives, I'll just remind the audience that there is a question and answer time that you can add in your questions to the conversation. And that dialogue box should just be below where the video is playing. So if you do have a question for any of the panelists, please do enter it now, and we'll get to that soon. In the meantime, my question for Dan is, one of the stories or one of the messages from the Conservatives before the campaign was to explain Erin O'Toole's apparent unpopularity or the low polling for the Conservatives as the fact that he was a pandemic leader. He was elected to the top of the party during the pandemic, and he hadn't had a chance to really introduce himself to Canadians in a meaningful way. But then when the campaign finally started, we saw him spend a lot of time in Ottawa, much more than I think we've generally seen from any campaign that we've run or that I've seen in Canada. And I'm wondering what the gain was, or was it a misplay to have him so often in Ottawa in that studio doing virtual events rather than having that time to be across the country and meeting people?
Yeah, the way we looked at that is most of the time, where you have campaign events with leaders interacting with people, they are frankly almost exclusively your partisans. You know, when you see the leader kind of campaigning at a campaign office, shaking hands or speaking at a rally, most of those people are already supporters or people leaning your way. And so what using the studio allowed us to do was two things. One, very, very clean, professional prime ministerial looking videos and press conferences to really have people who had not really seen Erin before, because, you know, as we've seen, we've had the prime minister on our screens every day, but really not the typical sort of politics you'd have. So to introduce him to Canadians, to show him as somebody who they can picture leading the country, and I think we succeeded in that. And then the second piece was doing a lot of telephone and video town halls where we would reach thousands of people and have them get to hear from him, get to see him, get to ask him questions, where we were calling out to thousands, tens of thousands of people and reaching a lot more actual undecided and not partisans than you would through traditional events. And that's what
did it pay off? Do we know? Does the party know if it paid off?
We don't 100% know yet. We're doing a huge amount of research now and analyzing and crunching some of those numbers. We want to know that because that will impact how much of this we do next time. But we do know that we talk to a lot more sort of non-partisans and non-supporters than we would have in a traditional campaign.
Jennifer, was there anything that the NDP saw from that you saw working or not working, or did it not have an effect for you guys?
I mean, I can appreciate from a campaign director's point of view the amount of control you get to exercise when everything's in a studio in Ottawa and you don't have to worry about anybody being late for an event or anything going sideways. I don't think it's an approach that ever would have worked for us. I mean, I think Jagmeet really thrives with people and gets energy, and I think that was the right call for us to make. But I think it was an interesting campaign innovation to do so much, I think probably forced by the pandemic, to do so much from a studio location. And I don't know if it will stick around or not. It may, but I don't think it would have worked for us. I can appreciate, though, how, you know, when so much is outside of your control, locking things down in the West and in Ottawa takes a lot of those variables out of the window for you as a campaign director.
Right. And did it make it easier for the Liberals to contrast with Erin O'Toole?
I think it did, you know, and I would echo, you know, in a different way, but partly what Jennifer said about Mr. Singh, that, you know, the Prime Minister has, I think, throughout his time in public life shown that, you know, he is at his best when he's with people. And, you know, so much of the pandemic, that wasn't possible for any of us. And we went virtual in so many different ways because of that, not because anyone, I think, wanted to be in front of computer screens as much as we all end up being, but because it was a way of staying connected in between. And I think the Liberal Party did great work on things like the National Convention, where you do plant in a studio in one set of time. But when the Prime Minister could get out to people and do so in a safe way, I think that is an entirely different level for him, that he's then able to really, I think, speak to people in a compelling way. I think of events like the drive-in rally in Oakville that I think really projected the energy and a strong get out the vote message from him, with, I guess, about 8 days to go at that point. And those kind of events can help drive things home. And we've certainly seen that there's a big impact to where the Prime Minister goes in the sort of tales that he can bring with him to helping get candidates across the line.
Okay, and Jennifer, this is my last question before we go to the Q&A. I want to know what the NDP got from putting their leader on TikTok. Jagmeet Singh had a TikTok. The other parties didn't even seem to think it was worth being on TikTok. There was a lot of discussion during the campaign about, for example, that shower video that Mr. Singh did near the end of the campaign, and whether that, you know, showed a lack of seriousness from a prospective prime ministerial candidate. And then also, of course, things like his participation in video games. What was the benefit for the party of doing those things?
Well, I think the benefit for us is reaching people where they are. I mean, and in a pandemic, people are gathering in different places. So in other times, in other campaigns, in this campaign, we saw leaders go and hang out at pubs and pull pints for people. Kind of a lighthearted approach, but a way to connect. TikTok, video games are another way to connect. And I'll just say about TikTok, you know, one TikTok video that Jagmeet has put out has 5 million views. Cost nothing to produce, took very little time to do. And 5 million, 95% of those in Canada have watched it. And we have heard in focus groups, people that have seen him on TikTok, and that's how they know him. I have in my own family many people who connect to him through TikTok, and that's how they know him. And that's some of the reasons they are voting for him. So I don't underestimate the power of that medium. I think, you know, the next phase for us is to continue to figure out ways to take that engagement and harness it and turn it into votes. But I would submit that if any of the other leaders could get that kind of engagement on TikTok, they'd be on TikTok.
Okay, so I'll just really quickly from Dan and Braden get a yes or no. Will your leaders be on TikTok in the next campaign? And then we'll bring in David.
Like, I know video is going to be a really important part of next campaign as it was this time. I think it'll be even more important next time. I don't know about TikTok specifically. I can't comment on that, but definitely going to be continue to do more video.
Braden?
Video is king. I would just say, you know, also Facebook, Instagram, there's all sorts of other platforms where the Prime Minister has millions of followers and a really strong community, people who've been following along on those platforms for a long time and engaging with him. It's part of what I mentioned about that drive to open up the party and how we've been able to build from those communities into real action in real life, as is said online, to get people knocking on doors. So absolutely important to keep building on those social communities, but you have to work with all platforms, you know, not only one of them.
Okay, so I want to bring in David Coletto back to the conversation for the audience question and answer part. And I'll ask everybody to make sure their mics are unmuted. And we'll just try and go sort of a really sort of hot takes quick around so we can get to as many questions as possible in the very short time that we have. The first is on the protests, which I think is a really good thing to raise because they dominated, especially national media attention for a lot of the campaign. And so, Braden, the question I guess I'll put first to you and then I'll get the others to weigh in is, were you expecting the protests, and did the campaign try and capitalize on them, or did it change how you were campaigning?
I don't think protests of that, you know, persistence and at times size during a pandemic were considered or expected as much. I don't think, you know, it would be correct at all to say capitalized on it. I think people who have known, you know, the Prime Minister for a long time, or who know people on that bus, or know young people, kids, families who are going to, you know, a political event, you want to be able to see them doing that safely and without feeling like their health is being put in danger or other forms of danger. So, you know, I think that was a concern. You think of events like Bolton when, you know, a political event that in a democracy should not be impeded from taking place was entirely blocked. That's a challenge for sure. But I think the Prime Minister addressed that that evening in a very important way, in a very real way that, you know, addressed the frustrations that people had, but also was very clear about our commitment around fighting and finishing this pandemic.
Jennifer, is that how you saw it?
You know, we also had protests and protesters at many of the events. It's not, frankly, a new thing for Jagmeet. He has faced, you know, some pretty vile hatred through most of his career and most of his life. I think, you know, we took more of an approach to try to de-escalate those situations when they happened. Jagmeet was, you know, at the poutine truck in Montreal and had somebody right up in his face. And his approach was to try to de-escalate that. So I think we took a slightly different approach to those kinds of protests. And, you know, it's something you have to plan for, frankly, in a leader's tour these days. I'm not sure that there was any greater or, you know, stronger than I've seen in the past, but it is something that we plan for.
Okay, and Dan, I was with the Liberals the first week, with the Conservatives the second week. You guys seem to run much more of a bubble campaign. Was that to avoid the protests, or what factor did that have with you?
Yeah, I mean, we as Conservatives are very used to having protests, and it's sort of impacted, I think, a lot of how many of our people plan events is out of a fear of protests and the knowledge that, you know, if we do have events disrupted by protests, it tends to be reported as quite negative for us. I think in this campaign, if anything, the protest probably did help the Liberal campaign, and that it allowed the Prime Minister to position his sort of campaign as, you know, him versus these extreme protesters, and sort of try to position that as the choice. And I think that was helpful to them. But you know, we ran a campaign where we tried to get out there, but also sort of be careful that you know, we don't have events disrupted.
And David, when you're looking at sort of the trajectory of the polls, did you see the protests move the needle in any way?
I don't think in terms of like people's choice, but I think what it did is, I think Dan said it sort of, it raised the stakes of the election a little bit for particularly sort of liberal oriented voters who maybe weren't sure why we were in the midst of this campaign, and maybe made a starker choice, not between the main parties, but just simply on the issues that got people so riled up that they were willing to sort of follow along the Prime Minister's campaign. So I don't think it changed the outcome, but it probably gave particularly the Liberal campaign a little bit of fuel to engage their own supporters.
Okay, I'm going to go to Jennifer next for this question, because I think it's something that some people in Ottawa are also wondering about. The question is, why is O'Toole on the hot seat, but Jagmeet Singh is not, or seems to be getting a pass? I think this person maybe means in terms of leadership, given that neither leader was able to significantly grow their footprint in Parliament. Can you talk to me a bit about whether you think Mr. Singh will face a leadership challenge, or what the culture is around the NDP that doesn't seem to have the knives out as quickly as they have been on Mr. O'Toole?
Well, I think New Democrats by and large are proud of the campaign that we ran, and that's been the overwhelming feedback that we've received. We've all been on the phones with candidates who were successful and not successful and other activists. And while there's disappointment about the result, people are proud of Jagmeet and they're proud of the campaign that we ran. We also tend to, with the glaring exception of one, give our leaders a lot more time to build towards a win. People often think of Jack and the breakthrough in 2011. They forget that there was 10 years before that of not breakthroughs and a lot of building and a lot of learning. And so I think, New Democrats, we just know that giving leaders some time to build and grow and do that work is better in the long run for success than dumping a leader every time things go awry.
And Dan, are you trying to bring that culture to the Conservatives? I know that the Conservatives have their first caucus meeting tomorrow, which I think might be tense at times. So maybe shed a bit of light for us on the efforts being made by Mr. O'Toole's team to ensure that he does get that second chance.
Yeah, look, I understand, many conservatives are concerned, and rightfully so, about the direction of the country under Mr. Trudeau, and feel that there is a very urgent need for change in this country. Conservatives also understand that in the past it has taken us time to do that. It took Mr. Harper, for example, 2 elections to earn the trust of Canadians. And I think that the people I talk to, most of them understand that, we made progress in this election in terms of earning that trust, but there is more to do, and that you are not going to achieve that if you keep changing leaders every election. And so I think that, the message that the campaign team, that the leader has been expressing to Conservatives is, we recognize we didn't do everything right. We recognize we could have done more, but we introduced a leader to Canadians. He did well. He showed he's a good campaigner. And we are very well positioned for next time. And the response we're getting to that is a very good one.
David, I'm going to put the next question to you. And I'm wondering, foreign policy rarely gets a lot of play in Canadian elections, but Afghanistan certainly got a lot of airtime in the first few weeks of the campaign. Did it have an impact, do you think, on the actual campaign?
I think it added to the mood, when the election was called, and it added to the sense that, is this the right time to have an election? I think the timing of that just made people even more skeptical of whether we should be in the middle of a campaign. But I don't think it ended up having any impact on people's choice. Like the data point I have is when we asked people, how important are different issues, only 4% put it in their top 2 or 3 of issues that actually drove their vote through the campaign. So I don't think Afghanistan nor any real foreign policy issue had much play. China, to some extent, I think in some ridings, it appears that it could have been the reason why, the Conservatives lost a handful of seats with large Chinese Canadian populations. But I think that was, very isolated. And as a whole, foreign issues really didn't play a role.
Okay, we're already over time, so I'm going to have to wrap it there. Thank you all so much. I'm now going to turn it back to Kelly Jackson. Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you to David, Marika, Dan, Jennifer, and Braden. That was so great. And I could tell that we could have gone on for another hour there with all the questions coming in. I'd like to introduce Tenio Evangelista, Vice President, Infrastructure Government Relations at OMERS, to deliver today's appreciation remarks. Tenio?
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks to the Empire Club for putting on another post-election event. I think we all really enjoy these, and I know us at OMERS, we love our partnership with the Empire Club, and we look forward to many more. Hopefully not a post-federal election one anytime soon, but maybe a provincial one. I just want to thank all our guests, starting with David Coletto. Great presentation, David, as always. Some really interesting insights into the numbers and how they moved, how they didn't move. So really appreciate your time. Marika, great job as always as a moderator. Maybe they should get you to do the next debate. Maybe it'll run more smoothly. But you did a great job. Thank you. And to Jennifer, Dan, and Braden, thanks for your time and thanks for the insights into the campaigns. I know it's not always easy, especially if you're not the winner, to come and talk about what went wrong, what went right. But we really appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tenio. And thanks again to all of our panelists and everybody who joined us today or will be participating and tuning in at a later date. Our next event is going to take place on October 14th at noon Eastern Time. It's going to be a fall market update with the Honourable Kinga Surma, Ontario's Minister of Infrastructure. And then on October 18th, also at noon, Peter Mansbridge will be joining us to moderate a panel discussion on the affordability of aging at home. More details on these events and complimentary registration is available at theempireclubofcanada.com. This meeting is now adjourned. Have a great evening, stay safe, and take care.